Well, hey, welcome. Does Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49 emphasize that the sin of Sodom is inhospitality or not? My name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. And we're going to try to answer that question looking at one particular article by author Brian Neil Peterson. And Brian Neil Peterson is the assistant professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee. Lived in Tennessee for a number of years, in Middle and West Tennessee, not East Tennessee where Cleveland is, but he's written two books. He wrote one book in 2012, Ezekiel in Context, and then another book he wrote in 2016, What is the Sin of Sodom? And this article was also published in 2016, which is like a snapshot of what his book is about. The article is The Sin of Sodom Revisited. It's in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Studies. The subtitle is Reading Genesis 19 in Light of Torah. Okay, and so again, this was published back in 2016. It's about 14 pages long. I'm going to read to you just one section where he starts to discuss Ezekiel. Remember, he wrote a whole book on Ezekiel, so he's very well versed in the book of Ezekiel. Then he wrote a whole book, I think perhaps maybe inspired by his work in Ezekiel on the subject of what the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is. But I think he has a lot of good things to say. You can actually find this article for free with a simple Google search online. Just search Brian Neil Peterson, What is the Sin of Sodom? And it'll pop up for you. I'll include the link to that article in like the comments or description of this video. All right. But I want to share with you just for a moment what he has to say about Ezekiel 16:49 and Ezekiel 16 as a whole, and how to read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because I think he's got some good things to share with us. So here we go. He says on page 21, Ezekiel 16:49 is the most oft quoted prophetic text trotted out in support of the inhospitality reading. Okay. For example, he gives the author Nisanen as just one example of how many modern contemporary exegetes, affirming authors, use or interpret Ezekiel 16:49 as saying, "Hey, this is saying the sin of Sodom is inhospitality, not homosexuality." And this he gives that example from Nisanen's book Homoeroticism. But right after he gives this example of Nisanen, he has a pretty punchy quote. He says, "It is this type of disingenuous handling of the text that has created an entire generation of poor exegetes who marshal this text in support of their erroneous conclusions." That's pretty intense right there, right? But here's what he says the reality is. He says the reality is not Ezekiel's emphasizing the sin of Sodom as inhospitality. And it's just kind of funny, when you think about it, like Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible and biblical literature becomes like the epitome of sin and wickedness. And are they really the epitome of sin and wickedness because of inhospitality? Right? Is that's what makes you the number one example of what it means to be wicked, in which Israel is constantly compared and contrasted with? Or is it something else? The hospitality rating, just in that observation, just makes me like, is it really, guys? Really? That doesn't sound very convincing, but that's just me. He says the reality is that Ezekiel does mention the sexual practices of Sodom and Gomorrah in the very next verse, in Ezekiel 16, verse 50, though this is rarely noted by affirming interpreters and authors. Okay, the key aspect he says here in this verse, Ezekiel 16:50, is Ezekiel's use of the term toeva, which is translated abomination. It is in the singular and not the plural, and that is a very important observation because he says the singular corresponds to this, how it's used in the singular in the sex laws of Leviticus 18, and Leviticus 18 is located within the what is it called? The purity code, right? The purity laws, the purity section of Leviticus 17 through 26, 17 through 27. In Leviticus 18, he says, only is sin of homosexuality, only the sin of homosexuality is referred to as an abomination, or that word toeba is used in the singular. So that's the only sin that's used in reference, called an abomination and used in the singular in the holiness code. I think that's what I was referring to, the holiness code there in Leviticus 18 and 20, specifically Leviticus 18:22 and 20 verse 13. Now, toeva is used in the plural also in the holiness code in chapter 18, verse 26, 27, 29, and 30, he notes. He also says sexual sins are the focus when Ezekiel uses this singular toeva, abomination, elsewhere in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 22, verse 11, and chapter 33, verse 26. All right. And he says, remember, Ezekiel is a priest and would be very familiar with the holiness code of Leviticus. All right. He then notes in this one section in his article on Ezekiel a common retort to this response to the inhospitality reading, and the retort in his response using toeva is that it is said, verse 50, many argue that abomination is merely an encapsulating term for all the listed sins that come before it. But this argument, he says, falls flat when read on to verse 51, and we see that Ezekiel uses the plural abominations, the plural of toeva, to do that very thing for the totality of Jerusalem's and Sodom's implied sins. Okay, so the singular abomination, or a toeva, means something distinct. All right, and he says this is bolstered by a similar use of the singular and plural forms of toeva in Ezekiel 18, 10 through 13. Therefore, he concludes, Ezekiel makes it clear what the sins, parentheses, more than one, of Sodom were. It is not a matter of pitting inhospitality against homosexual activity. There's many sins of Sodom, right? There's many different things that they did that were wicked. It's not an either or both. It's not an either or option, but he says it's a both and in terms of how Sodom has been described in Genesis 19 and other places. But at the heart of Sodom and Gomorrah's actions was a, quote, human arrogance in relation to God. And there he's quoting Robert Gagnon from his book on this topic of homosexuality. In the last paragraph of this section where he discusses Ezekiel, he says, of course, this doesn't even take into consideration the explicitly sexual nature of Ezekiel 16 as a whole, which is all about sexual deviance in the context of marriage. Verse 43, he says, connects Jerusalem's sins with sexual debauchery by the use of the term zima. Now, then he notes Donald Wold, who wrote a book called Out of Order, points out that this term zima refers to premeditated sexual crimes. And this word can be found in Leviticus 18:17, 20:14, Judges 20, verse 6, Ezekiel 16:27, and verse 58, Ezekiel 22, verse 9, Ezekiel 23, verse 27, verse 29, verse 35, verse 44, verse 48, and then Ezekiel 24, verse 13. So Wold points out that this term refers to premeditated sexual crimes, a situation similar to that depicted in Genesis 19 and Judges 19. Okay. Now, if you look down at the bottom of the page, when you look at that article online, you'll see footnote 32, which says, note also Leviticus 19:29, Job 31:11, Jeremiah 13:27, Ezekiel 22, verse 11, Ezekiel 23, verse 21 and verse 49, Proverbs 21, verse 27, and Proverbs 24, verse 29, where you see toeba and zima being used in parallel lines. That's an interesting observation. I wanted to include that footnote here. But he says, we may conclude that those who highlight inhospitality as the only sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, or as the emphasized sin of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, and also using Ezekiel 16 verse 49 as support of that inhospitality reading of Genesis 19. They're not presenting the entire picture. All right. And I think Peterson's conclusion here is a non-affirming conclusion, and it's pointing out that we're not really taking into consideration the entire picture, he says, of Torah, because Sodom and Gomorrah is a story that's written to be read and to teach and to kind of explain as like a narrative commentary of Torah, where we see the Torah laws, the Torah instruction come later in such places as the Holiness Code in Leviticus 18 and chapter 20. All right. And so one thing that comes to my mind when reading this section in his article is that, there's a common thought today, especially even a book by this title, that there's like 6 clobber passages that non-affirming Christians use to blast and clobber those who have an affirming reading or those who are LGBTQ. And why? Why is that a popular retort? 6 clobber passages, when you actually get into Scripture, you see how much more that this subject is actually broached and discussed, just not as explicitly as in Leviticus 18 and 20, Genesis 19, and those few passages, and in the New Testament, particularly Romans 1. I don't know. It just seems, like he says, disingenuous. He calls the Inhospitality reading disingenuous, and I find that the 6 clobber passage argument is also quite disingenuous, because when you start digging into below the surface of Scripture, you see this subject broached so much more, just less explicitly. And so ironically, what you have here, what Peterson helps us see, is that the exact opposite meaning is actually the case here in Ezekiel 16. The inhospitality reading, the inhospitality emphasis of the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not actually what Ezekiel is emphasizing was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, is not what Genesis 19 is emphasizing as the sin in those cities. Rather, it's the exact opposite. It is emphasizing sexual sins. There is inhospitality, there are sexual sins, and homosexuality was one of those sins that was being emphasized. And that's why, Paul kind of does what his Old Testament and Jewish literature does before him, which is he highlights homosexual behavior, both gay and lesbian sex in Romans 1, just like he sees in his Hebrew Bible and other Jewish literature that he knew and read and was well versed in. And so, yeah, this is just kind of ironic how affirming authors and interpreters try to use Ezekiel 16:49 to say something that Ezekiel isn't really saying at all. And we see that just in the very next verse, in 16 verse 50, and within the chapter overall, right? And so I'll stop there. Go ahead, find that article online and read it, because I think that Brian Neil Peterson is really going to help us become better Bible readers, re-enchant our understanding of Scripture, both in Genesis 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and beyond, right? And his work in Ezekiel, which helped lead him to this next book he wrote in 2016 called What is the Sin of Sodom? I think that he is actually, a prominent voice on this subject and topic today, more so than even, let's say, Richard Hayes. And again, I want to say more about that, as his book with his son, Christopher Hayes, is going to be coming out later this fall. The claim that Richard Hayes was like the leading voice, non-affirming voice on this subject, I think is also not really the case. The Moral Vision New Testament, sure, he took a non-affirming stance on that topic. But there's many other voices out there, many other scholars writing. Brian Neil Peterson is a less known and familiar name and voice in the biblical scholarly world, but he's a voice that we need to know. And so I'm trying to highlight him and his work in this video. I'm going to stop there now. For real, serious. All right. Thanks for watching to the end, guys. We'll see you later. Bye.